It is generally said that truth is the first casualty of war. But what we are not told, what this aphorism does not say, is when truth is first injured, after hostilities break out, or do the injuries begin as the drums of war are already beginning to sound, when propaganda begins to prepare the soil for war, when the dehumanization of the enemy takes people from regarding another people as a fellow human community with interesting similarities and differences to regarding it as less than human, less than a society, a monster. Arguably, as far as China in the current Cold War being waged against it is concerned, the most fundamental lie that you can tell about China is that it is not a society embarked for the last 7 decades on building socialism, that it is simply capitalist, that is in fact worse, simply a bad version of capitalism. Because once that's done, then you can basically say all sorts of things, that it is violating human rights, that it's stealing technology, that it's manipulating currency and whatever not. It's very clear that what's happening today represents a big sea change from how China has been portrayed in Western discourse until quite recently. As people will remember, in the 1990s and a good part of the 2000s, the idea was that the West was going to embrace China and engage with China. And the idea was that this was going to be good for the West and everybody else. However, the problem with this was that the West was doing this based on a number of illusions, and 2 in particular were very important. First, the West expected that the Chinese Communist Party would simply be transformed into some sort of social democratic party at best, or perhaps even a neoliberal party. And essentially, it would turn China into something not very different from the financialized, neoliberal, unproductive capitalist West. The second illusion was that they felt that China would become and remain a sort of low-cost producer of low-tech goods, which would service Western markets and relieve Western economies from having to produce those cheaper things. The fact of the matter is that both these illusions were based on the West's own greed. And today, when it is very clear that the Communist Party is not going to be transformed into a social democratic or a neoliberal party, when it is very clear that China is not only going to not remain a low-cost producer of low-tech goods, but is emerging as a major technological as well as a geopolitical presence in the world economy, the West has decided to treat it as an existential threat. The propaganda war that is now going on could easily prepare for a transition from the present Cold War against China to a hot war, possibly even a nuclear war. We see what is happening all around us, new alignments being created, the Quad being created, the AUKUS treaty being signed, even violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The biggest harm this can do, of course, is war. But even short of war, what is already happening is the impossibility of creating the cooperative relations we need to create at the world level in order to tackle major challenges. The pandemic, most obviously, the ecological emergency, which does not consist of just climate change, but many other elements, including loss of biodiversity, rising pollution, etc., all of which need international cooperation, as does development itself, the development of still very large parts of the third world. So that's why we are holding this webinar. We want to discuss the intensifying information warfare being waged by the US in particular against the People's Republic of China, by the US and by US allies. We want to discuss the relationship between this propaganda onslaught and the new Cold War, the realities in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong, which are particularly fingered by Western propaganda, and the participation of important sections of the Western left in encouraging and in fact in furthering this propaganda war. So we will discuss all these things and more. I'd like to conclude my introductory remarks for now by simply pointing out that this event is hosted by Friends of Socialist China, and it is co-sponsored by a number of organizations: the Morning Star, the Gray Zone, Pivot to Peace, the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, the International Manifesto Group, and the Chao Collective.